You know, it's easy to think of philosophy as something, well, confined to dusty books, kind of far removed from our everyday lives. But what if we told you that engaging with some of these big philosophical ideas could actually sharpen your understanding of something as visceral as art and maybe even deepen your experience of what it means to be alive?
Yeah.
That's exactly the kind of aha moment we're always digging for here on the deep dive.
And today we're venturing into just that kind of thought-provoking territory. We've got a really rich source material to work with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Nietzsche's aesthetics. Think of it as a meticulously crafted guide to understanding how one of history's most challenging thinkers grappled with the fundamental questions of art's nature and its value.
Right. Now, we totally get that diving into something like the Stanford Encyclopedia can feel a bit intimidating, like you're facing a mountain of dense information.
Hmm.
But that's where we come in. Consider us your Sherpas, here to navigate the essential ideas, extract the truly fascinating insights, and make sure you feel enlightened, not overwhelmed.
Our mission today is pretty straightforward: to understand how Nietzsche, really acting in his role as a philosopher, didn't just sit back and admire art. He actively interrogated it.
Mm.
He posed these profound questions about beauty, truth, and even the possibility that art holds a key to justifying our very existence.
And to do this, we're drawing on a fantastic synthesis of Nietzsche's own writings, everything from his groundbreaking first book, The Birth of Tragedy, to his later, more critical assessments, like The Case of Wagner, plus his personal notebooks filled with raw
Yeah,
ideas.
those notebooks are fascinating.
The Stanford Encyclopedia entry expertly weaves all of this together, and we're here to unpack the most crucial insights for you. Okay, let's unpack this. Nietzsche's engagement with aesthetics wasn't some passing fancy, was it?
Not at all. It was a central thread running through his entire philosophical project, right from the explosive arrival of The Birth of Tragedy in 1872, all the way through to the provocative statements in his final works. And The Birth of Tragedy itself was, well, a remarkably original contribution for its time, not only in its approach to philosophical aesthetics, but also in its engagement with classical scholarship. However, it didn't spring from nowhere. Nietzsche was deeply influenced by several key thinkers, and understanding their impact is essential for grasping the foundations of his early aesthetic views.
Okay, let's start with Arthur Schopenhauer. His influence on the young Nietzsche was really significant, wasn't it? Covering metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics. Schopenhauer's ideas were kind of everywhere.
Indeed. Schopenhauer's core philosophy rested on a few fundamental ideas. He agreed with Kant that we only experience appearances, not the underlying reality itself. But unlike Kant, Schopenhauer argued that the inner essence of this reality was a single, relentless, striving force he called will.
The will. Okay.
So you have transcendental idealism, the idea that space and time are subjective, they exist in our minds, not as features of the world as it truly is. And then will monism, the belief that everything is ultimately a manifestation of this one underlying will.
And this will wasn't exactly a source of joy, if I remember correctly, more like the opposite.
Not at all. Schopenhauer had a pretty bleak outlook. He believed that this constant, aimless striving of the will inevitably led to more suffering than pleasure in human life. Hence his famous philosophical pessimism, the conclusion that life isn't really worth living and that non-existence would actually be preferable.
Ooh, dark stuff.
It is, and it's against this rather dark backdrop that he developed his aesthetic theory.
So how did art offer any kind of relief in this pessimistic worldview? It seems counterintuitive.
Well, for Schopenhauer, the pleasure we get from art, from experiencing beauty in general, is unique because it's disinterested.
Mm.
When we truly appreciate something beautiful, our consciousness becomes absorbed in its pure, objective qualities. We focus entirely on what the object is, rather than how it relates to our own desires, our own striving will, or our personal interests. Crucially, Schopenhauer saw this aesthetic appreciation as a temporary silencing of the will. Since the will is the source of all our suffering, this willless state offers a brief escape, a moment of peace and relief from the constant burden of existence. Think of it as a temporary pause button on the engine of suffering.
Almost like a mini mental vacation from the endless demands of being, like hitting pause on the stress.
Precisely. And while he believed all aesthetic appreciation had this quality of silencing the will, Schopenhauer held tragedy in particularly high regard. He saw tragedy as powerfully revealing the ultimate futility of all our striving, the inherent nothingness of this whole existence, through dramatic examples of human suffering. For him, the very content of tragedy ultimately reflected his own pessimistic philosophy.
Now, Nietzsche, in his early work, The Birth of Tragedy, seemed to embrace a lot of this, right? The focus on suffering, the idea of aesthetic enjoyment as being somehow separate from our desires.
Yes, initially. The Birth of Tragedy does seem to operate under the assumption that Schopenhauer's descriptive claim about the fundamental nature of suffering is true. Nietzsche also explicitly endorses this idea of aesthetic enjoyment as essentially will-less in his early work.
Right.
He even adopts Schopenhauer's metaphysical distinction between the world, as it appears to us, and the underlying will, and also his intriguing theory of music as a direct expression of that nominal will, that reality beyond our senses.
But there were hints, even in The Birth of Tragedy, that Nietzsche might eventually head in a different direction, right? It wasn't a complete copy-paste.
Absolutely. Some scholars have pointed out subtle but significant differences between their theories of music even within the birth. And the really big question of whether Nietzsche fully and unequivocally accepted Schopenhauer's entire metaphysical system in that book is still actively debated by philosophers today.
Ah, the classic scholarly debate.
Exactly. Regardless of the final verdict on that, as Nietzsche's own philosophical voice matured, he clearly moved away from Schopenhauer's aesthetic ideas, ultimately rejecting the concept of disinterested appreciation and the inherent link between aesthetics and pessimism. But Schopenhauer remained a crucial figure for Nietzsche, almost like a philosophical sparring partner against whom he defined his own increasingly distinct views.
So Schopenhauer showed him the bleakness, maybe, but Nietzsche searched for a way to embrace that reality through art, not just escape it.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Not just escape, but affirm.
Okay, so that's Schopenhauer's profound influence. What about Richard Wagner? Their relationship was famously close, at least for a while, wasn't it? Almost legendary.
Indeed. Richard Wagner, the revolutionary composer, was another absolutely massive influence on the young Nietzsche, perhaps just as significant as Schopenhauer. Nietzsche was deeply impressed, almost captivated by Wagner's incredibly ambitious artistic goals, particularly his concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art.
The idea of bringing together all the different art forms into one unified creation, right? Music, poetry, drama, visual spectacle, the whole shebang.
Exactly. Wagner envisioned this as a profound synthesis, drawing inspiration from the power and communal nature of ancient Greek drama.
Sure.
But it wasn't just about simply combining different artistic mediums. It was also about creating a deeply communal, almost sacred experience for the audience.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to move away from art as mere passive entertainment and address a much deeper, almost spiritual and cultural need within the community. He fervently believed that art in this unified form could provide a new mythology to unite a modern, increasingly fragmented culture.
So art as a kind of secular religion, offering a shared sense of meaning to bind people together.
Something very much along those lines. Wagner felt that modern society was becoming far too specialized, individuals too isolated, and increasingly materialistic, which was leading to a deep sense of alienation. He believed that art, through this powerful new mythology expressed in the Gesamtkunstwerk, could offer a crucial sense of belonging, a shared worldview that spoke directly to people's senses and their imaginations, something deeply accessible to everyone, not just a select group of intellectuals.
And The Birth of Tragedy definitely shows this Wagnerian influence all over it. You can really feel it.
Unmistakably. Nietzsche's strong emphasis on the absolutely vital role of the chorus in ancient Greek tragedy, his passionate desire to see a rebirth of this powerful form of tragic art in Wagner's innovative music drama, it all profoundly echoes this core Wagnerian vision. He saw Wagner's artistic endeavors as a very real potential revival of this incredibly potent, unifying artistic force for their time.
But the famous bromance didn't exactly last, did it? It kind of imploded.
No, it certainly did not. Nietzsche eventually became deeply disillusioned with Wagner, and by the end of his life, his attitude towards the composer and his work was overwhelmingly negative and sharply critical. It's still debated by scholars whether he ultimately rejected the core artistic ideals themselves or simply felt that Wagner personally failed to live up to their immense promise.
Interesting distinction.
But regardless of the specifics of their falling out, Wagner and his ambitious artistic project remained absolutely central to Nietzsche's thinking throughout his entire intellectual career. He was always reacting to Wagner, in a way.
We should also make sure to mention Friedrich Schiller and the broader movement of German classicism as another really key influence on Nietzsche's early thinking, right?
Absolutely. Friedrich Schiller, the celebrated poet and philosopher, was a particularly significant figure for Nietzsche, especially during his formative early period. Schiller, much like many thinkers in the Romantic tradition, looked back at the ancient world, particularly ancient Greece, as a kind of golden age, a time of lost unity and natural harmony.
Right, that idealized past.
He famously distinguished between naive art, which he saw as spontaneously expressing that easy oneness with nature, and sentimental art, which poignantly reflected our modern longing for that lost harmony in an increasingly fragmented and self-conscious world.
And you can definitely see how that kind of thinking might have planted the initial seeds for Nietzsche's own concepts of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. That contrast feels similar.
Precisely. While Nietzsche certainly didn't adopt Schiller's view of the ancient Greeks wholesale, it undoubtedly influenced his understanding of the Apollonian element in particular. Schiller's important concept of beautiful semblance, schöner Schein, these non-deceptive illusions that we can enjoy purely for their own sake within the realm of art, also played a really crucial role in shaping Nietzsche's account of Apollonian art in The Birth of Tragedy.
Schönerschein. Beautiful semblance.
Yeah, it's the idea that we can take genuine pleasure in the mere appearance of things, in beautiful forms and images, without being fooled into thinking they are ultimate reality. Think of Schiller's idea of enjoying an illusion for its own sake as a precursor to Nietzsche's concept of the Apollonian drive, which finds beauty in form and appearance.
And Schiller's emphasis on the role of the tragic chorus in Greek drama also seems to have really resonated with Nietzsche.
Yes, absolutely. Schiller argued that the chorus provided a kind of ideal spectator within the tragedy itself, offering a distanced, more universal perspective that allowed the audience to see the tragic events as part of an idealized artistic creation. Nietzsche explicitly endorsed this very view in The Birth of Tragedy.
Okay.
However, he was more critical of Schiller's particular explanation of tragic pleasure as a specific form of the sublime that's related to our awareness of our own transcendental freedom. While Nietzsche certainly agreed that tragic pleasure was a kind of profound and even sublime experience, he ultimately rejected the somewhat moralistic interpretation that Schiller offered.
So he liked the idea of the chorus's role, but not Schiller's reason for why it worked that way.
Pretty much, yeah. He had a different take on the pleasure involved. And just like with Schopenhauer and Wagner, Nietzsche's view of Schiller also evolved and shifted over time, didn't it?
It certainly did. In his later years, Nietzsche became quite dismissive of Schiller, even rather harshly calling him a moral trumpeter, someone who used art to promote ethical ideals.
Ouch. Moral trumpeter.
Yeah, not exactly high praise from Nietzsche. However, some contemporary scholars argue that Schiller's influence, particularly those broader ideas within German classicism concerning artistic semblance and the positive valuation of the term naive, continued to shape Nietzsche's thought in more subtle ways, even after the publication of The Birth of Tragedy.
Okay, so with these really crucial intellectual influences firmly in mind, Schopenhauer's philosophical pessimism, Wagner's ambitious artistic vision, and Schiller's ideas about art in the ancient world, we can now really dive into the central problem that Nietzsche was grappling with in The Birth of Tragedy. What was he really trying to solve?
Exactly. The Birth of Tragedy is, at its core, a profound attempt to develop a comprehensive philosophical theory of tragedy, its fundamental nature, and its enduring value. In doing so, Nietzsche is directly engaging with a long and rich tradition of thought on tragedy that stretches all the way back to Aristotle.
Right, the big questions.
Traditionally, philosophical discussions of tragedy centered around two main questions. What is the inherent value of experiencing tragic art, and why do we, as human beings, seem to derive pleasure from it, given the undeniably unpleasant emotions that it so often evokes in us? Fear, pity.
Plato, of course, famously argued in his Republic that tragedy was actually quite harmful to its viewers, that it ultimately corrupted the rational part of our souls by appealing to our more irrational emotions. So the fundamental question of its value is definitely a long-standing one.
Right. Plato wasn't a fan.
Precisely. And while Nietzsche certainly does address these traditional questions concerning the value and the pleasure we find in tragedy within the birth, they weren't really his primary or sole focus. His chief aim was to suggest that humanity faces a truly profound and fundamental existential problem, and that tragedy specifically, the unique form of Attic tragedy and its supposed powerful rebirth in Wagner's innovative music drama, offers us a uniquely powerful and essential solution.
So, tragedy is the answer to some deep human problem.
Exactly. His answers to those more traditional questions about tragedy ultimately emerged from this much larger and more ambitious philosophical argument. So, as we see Nietzsche moving away from Schopenhauer, he's still fundamentally trying to answer the question,
Hmm.
how can art help us affirm life in the face of its inherent suffering and, well, maybe even meaninglessness?
So what exactly was this profound existential problem that Nietzsche so acutely identified? What was the big issue?
Well, there are a couple of different but related interpretations that scholars have put forward over the years. The most straightforward and perhaps most natural one is that the core problem is deeply rooted in Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophical pessimism. The fundamental idea that human life inherently involves significantly more suffering than genuine happiness, ultimately leading to the rather bleak conclusion that life is ultimately not worth living.
The life is suffering angle.
Right. Nietzsche's repeated and significant references to the ancient wisdom of Silenus, the powerful myth that the very best thing for a human being is never to have been born, and the second best is to die soon, very strongly suggest this particular interpretation.
Yeah, that's pretty pessimistic.
On this view, Nietzsche, at least in his early work, seems to acknowledge the fundamental truth of this deeply pessimistic outlook, much like he believed the ancient Greeks of the 6th and 5th centuries BC did.
Mm.
The crucial question then becomes, how do we, as human beings, respond to the undeniable terrors and horrors of existence? And Nietzsche's central argument in The Birth of Tragedy is that ancient Greek tragedy uniquely provided this essential answer.
But there's also another compelling way to look at it, one that perhaps focuses more on the influence of the Romantic movement and Wagner's own particular concerns about modern culture, less about suffering per se.
Yes, absolutely. Another significant perspective suggests that the primary problem for Nietzsche wasn't necessarily suffering itself in isolation, but rather a profound lack of meaning, the increasing fragmentation of modern culture, and the apparent absence of deeply shared and unifying cultural institutions and narratives.
Ah, the loss of shared myths.
Deeply inspired by the artistic ambitions of Richard Wagner and the broader concerns of the Romantic tradition, this particular view sees Nietzsche as fundamentally concerned with the modern sense of cultural homelessness, our feeling of not truly belonging in the world. On this reading, the central aim of The Birth of Tragedy is to demonstrate how the powerful experience of the ancient tragic festival could help us to regain that deeply felt lost sense of communal belonging by providing a strong and unifying mythic worldview.
That makes sense with the Wagner influence.
Right. Nietzsche himself explicitly criticizes the contemporary state of German culture for what he saw as its distinct lack of this kind of deeply grounding mythic foundation.
It seems like these two problems, the pervasiveness of suffering and the pervasive lack of meaning, could be very deeply intertwined with each other, though. They're not totally separate.
Absolutely. Meaningless suffering would certainly seem to be a particularly profound existential issue for human beings. You could certainly argue that Schopenhauer's deeply pessimistic view of life only leads to the ultimate conclusion that life is fundamentally worthless, precisely because he rejects any traditional religious or philosophical narratives that might otherwise give human suffering some larger sense of meaning or purpose.
Right, without a framework, suffering just is.
Exactly. Someone with deeply held religious beliefs, for example, might very well accept that suffering is an inherent part of the human condition, but still find profound meaning within a larger spiritual framework. So, The Birth of Tragedy could certainly be interpreted as grappling with this very core problem of seemingly meaningless suffering, trying to find a powerful way to affirm the value of human life even in the face of its undeniable inherent difficulties and pain.
Okay.
Regardless of the precise emphasis, it's very clear that Nietzsche saw the art form of tragedy as providing a crucial and deeply significant response to a very deep-seated and fundamental human challenge.
And it's to explain this unique response that he introduces his famously enduring concepts of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Here they come.
Indeed. The Apollonian and the Dionysian are undoubtedly the most widely recognized and discussed aspects of Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. Initially, Nietzsche presents them not just as artistic styles, but as two fundamental and powerful art drives that are actually operating in nature itself.
Thrives in nature. Interesting.
The Apollonian is closely associated with the representational arts, things like painting, sculpture, epic poetry, artistic forms that deal in clear and distinct forms and well-defined outlines, much like the Greek god Apollo himself. The Dionysian, on the other hand, is linked to the non-representational, more intensely expressive arts like music and lyric poetry, deeply embodying the ecstatic, often chaotic, and overwhelming nature of the god Dionysus.
Order versus chaos, basically. Form versus something else.
Kind of, yeah. Nietzsche's really key argument is that the unique power of ancient Greek tragedy arose from its ability to achieve a truly remarkable and dynamic synthesis of these two seemingly opposing fundamental artistic impulses. The dramatic action and the spoken dialogue within the tragedy represented the clear, ordered Apollonian element, while the powerful and intoxicating music of the chorus embodied the more primal and overwhelming Dionysian.
So the play itself is Apollonian, the music is Dionysian, and tragedy brings them together.
Exactly. It's almost like the difference between carefully framing a beautiful photograph, Apollonian, and the raw, overwhelming feeling of being at a powerful concert, Dionysian.
But these aren't just simple categories for understanding different kinds of art, are they? They quickly take on a much deeper, almost metaphysical significance within the book. They become about reality itself.
Exactly. In many passages throughout the birth of tragedy, Nietzsche seems to use the Apollonian and the Dionysian to refer to two truly fundamental metaphysical aspects of the world itself, in a way that certainly echoes the philosophical ideas of Schopenhauer. The Apollonian becomes closely associated with the world of appearances, the realm of distinct individual beings existing in space and time, and fundamentally governed by the principle of causality.
The world we see and experience day to day.
Right. This is the world governed by the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, the idea that we experience ourselves as separate, distinct individuals. The Dionysian, in stark contrast, represents the underlying non-spatiotemporal monistic reality, the fundamental primordial unity, the will, the world will, that lies deep beneath the surface of our seemingly separate individual existences.
So the Apollonian is the surface, the individual things, and the Dionysian is the deep underlying oneness, like Schopenhauer's will.
That's the idea. For Schopenhauer, and initially Nietzsche it seems, the entire world we perceive, including time and space, is fundamentally a construct of our minds. And beneath it all is this relentless, blind force called the will.
So in his early work, Nietzsche really seems to be on board with Schopenhauer's core ideas of transcendental idealism and will monism. That's the standard view.
That's certainly the orthodox reading, the traditional and long-standing interpretation of the birth of tragedy. Many scholars have argued that the book essentially incorporates Schopenhauer's entire metaphysical framework wholesale. They point to Nietzsche's explicit use of key Schopenhauerian terms like principium individuation and Urein, the primal unity, his direct references to Kant and Schopenhauer's shared critique of philosophical optimism, his strong endorsement of Schopenhauer's specific theory of music, and even his powerful description of the metaphysical joy that we experience in tragedy as a kind of fleeting glimpse into this underlying fundamental reality.
But this purely metaphysical reading isn't universally accepted by contemporary scholars anymore, is it? There's been a strong counter-argument that's gained traction in recent years. People are pushing back.
Precisely. A significant trend in more recent Nietzsche scholarship argues against this straightforwardly metaphysical interpretation of the birth of tragedy. These so-called anti-metaphysical readings suggest that while the book certainly contains numerous metaphysical-sounding claims, Nietzsche actually presents them in a much more self-consciously fictional, symbolic, or even metaphorical way. Maybe he didn't literally believe it all.
What's the primary evidence that these scholars point to in support of this alternative reading? Why do they think it's metaphorical?
There are a few key pieces of textual evidence that are typically cited. First, there's an early notebook entry by Nietzsche, dating from before he wrote The Birth of Tragedy, where he explicitly criticizes Schopenhauer's somewhat problematic identification of Kant's unknowable thing in itself with his own concept of the striving will.
Early doubts.
Which suggests that Nietzsche may have harbored significant doubts about Schopenhauer's metaphysics even before he published his first book. Second, and perhaps more strikingly, there's a very surprising and somewhat puzzling passage actually within The Birth of Tragedy itself, section 18, for those keeping score, where Nietzsche explicitly describes metaphysical solace, the comforting idea of an indestructible eternal life that exists beneath the often harsh world of appearances as itself being a form of illusion.
Wait, he calls the metaphysical solace an illusion in the same book.
Yeah, placing on the very same level as the Apollonian illusion of distinct individuals, and the ultimately futile Socratic pursuit of knowledge.
That's a pretty significant statement if he's also seemingly espousing a very similar metaphysical view elsewhere in the very same book. That feels like a contradiction.
Exactly. And the third key piece of evidence that proponents of the anti-metaphysical reading often highlight is Nietzsche's consistent and pervasive emphasis on the fundamental importance of myth throughout the birth of tragedy. The central argument here is that Nietzsche, in those passages where he seems to be advancing a grand and sweeping metaphysical theory of reality, is actually engaged in a more pragmatic project,
Okay.
trying to provide 19th century German culture with the kind of deeply unifying and culturally resonant mythic worldview that he believed it desperately and urgently needed.
So the metaphysics is the myth he thinks they need.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
His explicit admission in that rather surprising passage about metaphysical solace being a mere illusion could then be interpreted as a subtle hint that the entire underlying metaphysical framework of the birth of tragedy is ultimately intended as this kind of necessary and culturally valuable myth, rather than as a literal or dogmatic philosophical claim about the ultimate nature of reality.
So, on this reading, it's not really about whether these metaphysical claims are literally true in some objective sense, but more about whether they serve a valuable cultural or even psychological purpose. It's about function, not truth.
That's the very core of the anti-metaphysical interpretation. Now, naturally, those scholars who still adhere to the more traditional metaphysical view of the birth of tragedy have attempted to respond to these various points.
Of course. How do they respond?
They might argue, for instance, that while Nietzsche may have certainly entertained early doubts about specific aspects of Schopenhauer's philosophy, he still largely adhered to a basic dichotomy between a unified underlying will and the phenomenal world of appearances for a significant period, at least up to the time of writing The Birth. Some have even suggested that the later Schopenhauer himself subtly nuanced his own view of the will in ways that actually bring it closer to Nietzsche's apparent position in his first book.
And how do they typically address that rather problematic passage about metaphysical solace being an illusion? That seems like the biggest hurdle.
Some argue that Nietzsche is specifically calling the feeling of solace an illusion, not necessarily the entire underlying metaphysics of the will itself.
Ah, a subtle distinction.
Others point out the inherent oddity and even paradox of the passage if it's read as a straightforward and complete rejection of that metaphysics. The seemingly strange idea that the fundamental metaphysical will would actively create the very illusion of its own indestructible existence. They suggest that we need a much more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of exactly what Nietzsche means by illusion in that specific context.
Okay, that's fair. And what about Nietzsche's strong emphasis on the importance of myth? How do they reconcile that with a literal metaphysical reading?
As these scholars have rightly pointed out, simply emphasizing the cultural or societal importance of myth doesn't automatically mean that Nietzsche's own metaphysical claims are therefore intended as merely mythical. It only really becomes a significantly stronger argument in favor of the anti-metaphysical reading when it's considered in conjunction with those other key pieces of textual evidence we discussed earlier. So the ongoing debate about the precise metaphysical status of the birth of tragedy remains a really fascinating and still very active area of scholarly discussion and interpretation. It's not settled.
This inherent tension between a deep-seated philosophical pessimism and a kind of powerful life affirmation also seems to be absolutely central to really understanding the complex arguments within the birth of tragedy. Was Nietzsche ultimately agreeing with Schopenhauer's rather negative overall assessment of human life? Or was he instead offering a radical and perhaps unexpected way to overcome that pervasive pessimism? Which side did he land on early on?
That's another absolutely key point of divergence among the various interpreters of Nietzsche's early work. Some scholars firmly believe that the birth of tragedy represents a very clear and decisive rejection of Schopenhauer's normative pessimism, arguing that Nietzsche's fundamental aim was to demonstrate how the Greeks actually got over pessimism through the unique power of their tragic art.
Right, art as the antidote to pessimism.
They often point to Nietzsche's later, more explicitly retrospective remarks in his autobiographical Ecce Homo, where he very directly states that tragedy provides the definitive proof that the ancient Greeks were most certainly not pessimists. And even within the birth of tragedy itself, you can find powerful claims like, the arts generally make life possible and worth living, and the incredibly famous assertion that Only as an aesthetic phenomenon are existence and the world eternally justified.
Eternally justified. That sounds pretty anti-pessimistic.
If human existence is indeed eternally justified, it would seem to directly contradict Schopenhauer's rather gloomy view that it fundamentally ought not to be.
But then there are those other, much darker passages within The Birth of Tragedy that seem to very strongly echo Schopenhauer's deeply pessimistic sentiments about the nature of reality. He sounds like Schopenhauer sometimes.
Exactly. Nietzsche also explicitly describes the art form of tragedy as containing a profound and pessimistic worldview, clearly highlighting the idea of individualization, of being a separate being, as the very fundamental root of all evil and suffering, and expressing a profound hope for some kind of liberating metaphysical overcoming or breaking free from this painful condition, which aligns very closely indeed with the core tenets of Schopenhauer's philosophical thought.
Right, the pain of being an individual.
He even quite explicitly identifies the very content of the tragic myth with the ancient wisdom of Silenus, that profoundly pessimistic idea that the very best thing for a human being is never to have been born.
Back to Salinas.
And the fact that Nietzsche suggests that both the beauty of Apollonian art and the profound experience of tragedy ultimately justify human existence only through the power of illusions raises the really troubling question of whether, in the full light of ultimate knowledge and truth, one would still be able to genuinely affirm the value of life.
Ah, the illusion point again.
This naturally leads some interpreters to argue that Nietzsche, at least during this early stage of his philosophical development, did indeed largely endorse Schopenhauer's fundamentally negative verdict on the ultimate value of human life.
So on this darker reading, was Nietzsche essentially suggesting that human life is only truly bearable or justifiable to us through the comforting embrace of these beautiful artistic lies? We need the illusions to survive.
That's really the crux of the more pessimistic interpretation of The Birth of Tragedy. It suggests that if art can only truly help us to affirm the value of our existence by fundamentally deceiving us about the true and perhaps ultimately unbearable nature of reality, then perhaps human life isn't genuinely worth living in and of itself. It's a really thorny and complex issue, especially when we consider Nietzsche's much stronger emphasis on the paramount importance of truthfulness in other areas of his mature philosophy. How does that square?
This core idea of the aesthetic justification of existence seems to be absolutely key to understanding Nietzsche's early philosophy. What exactly did he mean by that rather striking phrase? Can we unpack that a bit?
The core concept appears to be that the profound experience of tragedy somehow allows us as human beings to momentarily perceive the world with all of its inherent suffering, pain, and inevitable death from a kind of elevated God's eye perspective.
A cosmic view.
From this temporary, more detached and all-encompassing viewpoint, the entirety of existence, as a unified whole, appears as a terrible, perhaps even horrific, but ultimately a profoundly glorious and aesthetically valuable spectacle. Our own individual lives, with all their inevitable personal joys and sorrows, somehow gain aesthetic significance by playing an integral, albeit often painful, role in this grand, overarching, and ultimately aesthetically meaningful whole.
Okay.
Much like a dark shadow contributes to the overall beauty of a painting, or a dissonant chord adds depth and complexity to a powerful piece of music. Our suffering becomes part of the beauty.
He even draws a rather surprising analogy to Leibniz's famous Theodicy, which was an attempt to philosophically justify the existence of evil in a world that was supposedly created by an all-powerful and benevolent God. That seems like an odd comparison for Nietzsche.
Well, precisely. Nietzsche seems to be suggesting a very similar kind of justification for suffering and evil in the world, but one that's based on purely aesthetic rather than moral or religious grounds. The precise mechanism by which tragedy is supposed to communicate this profound aesthetic justification to its audience is somewhat obscure and open to interpretation. But it seems to heavily rely on the ancient Greek audience's deep identification with the tragic chorus, experiencing the dramatic action almost as a fleeting but powerful collective vision. This mirrors the way in which the underlying primal unity relates to the diverse and often painful empirical world of individual existence.
And again, the ongoing debate about the precise metaphysical status of the Book of Tragedy really colors how we ultimately interpret this idea. It keeps coming back to that.
It really does. If Nietzsche literally believed in this underlying world artist and the unified will, then perhaps this aesthetic justification could be seen as something genuinely real on a metaphysical level. But if it's all ultimately just a powerful and necessary myth, then perhaps the solace and justification it offers are themselves ultimately illusory.
Right. Is it real justification or just feels like it?
Exactly. And even if we accept the more traditional metaphysical reading of the birth of tragedy, it doesn't automatically follow that Nietzsche believed that individual human life was genuinely and fully justified in and of itself.
Hmm.
Some scholars have argued that if our individual suffering is ultimately merely a fleeting element in the primordial unity's cosmic entertainment, that doesn't necessarily provide any real justification or genuine solace for those of us who are actually experiencing the pain and loss firsthand. It might seem kind of cold, actually.
Yeah, your pain makes my cosmic artwork better isn't super comforting. He also frequently talks about the concept of metaphysical solace in The Birth of Tragedy. Is that essentially the same thing as this idea of aesthetic justification of existence? Or are there subtle but important differences between the two?
They are certainly closely related concepts, but there do appear to be some subtle but potentially significant differences between them. Nietzsche states that every truly great tragedy ultimately leaves its audience with this feeling of metaphysical solace. This seems to primarily involve the profound recognition that beneath the fleeting and often painful appearances of our individual existence, the underlying and eternal life of the will is untouched by our annihilation.
So solace comes from knowing something eternal endures, even if we don't.
That seems to be the core idea. So, while the idea of aesthetic justification seems to primarily focus on the experience of the world as a grand and unified spectacle, the concept of metaphysical solace appears to offer a more direct form of comfort in the idea of something fundamentally enduring and untouched by the inevitable suffering and death of individual beings.
Okay, I see the difference.
These two key ideas, while both deeply intertwined with the underlying metaphysics presented in The Birth of Tragedy, don't necessarily point in the exact same direction when it comes to fully assessing Nietzsche's overall commitment to or rejection of philosophical pessimism during this early period of his thought. It's complicated.
It's truly fascinating just how many different layers and potential interpretations there are within this single early work of Nietzsche's. It's so rich. Let's shift our focus now to another crucial area of his aesthetic thinking, his complex engagement with Plato's rather famous condemnation of art, the big showdown.
Yes, this is a really crucial aspect of Nietzsche's entire aesthetic project. In his later work on the genealogy of morality, he famously calls Plato the greatest enemy of art Europe has yet produced, directly referring to Plato's well-known argument in Book X of his Republic.
Strong words, greatest enemy.
Very strong. There, Plato contends that art, particularly representational art like painting and poetry, is fundamentally imitative and therefore a mere illusion, twice removed from true reality. Because of this illusory nature, Plato argues that art primarily appeals to the irrational, more emotional parts of our souls, rather than to our reason.
And Plato hated the irrational parts.
Right, given that Plato's main target in this critique was specifically the art form of Greek tragedy. The very art form that Nietzsche was so deeply invested in understanding and reviving. This fundamental clash between these two towering philosophical figures is hardly surprising.
But Nietzsche doesn't necessarily disagree with Plato's fundamental assessment that art is, in some important sense, false or based on illusion, does he? He kind of agrees on that point.
That's precisely what makes Nietzsche's position so incredibly interesting and somewhat surprising. Nietzsche often seems to fully accept Plato's fundamental charge that art is indeed inherently false, or at least not a direct representation of ultimate truth. His radical disagreement with Plato, and with many other philosophers throughout history, lies in the immense value that Plato and so many others traditionally place on the concept of objective truth.
Ah, so it's about the value of truth.
Exactly. Nietzsche provocatively questions whether truth is always and in every circumstance the absolute highest value for human beings. This radical inverted Platonism, as Nietzsche himself famously called it, suggests that things that are actually further removed from some supposed realm of true being, like the illusions and semblances that art so readily provides, might actually be more beautiful, more valuable, and even, in a certain sense, better for us.
Wow. Inverted Platonism.
He speaks quite approvingly of art as a kind of necessary cult of the untrue, and as an expression of a vital goodwill to semblance.
So, for Nietzsche, the inherent lie within art isn't necessarily a negative or a bad thing. It could be good.
Not at all. He even goes so far as to famously declare, "We have art so that we do not perish from the truth."
That's such a powerful line.
It is. This profoundly suggestive statement indicates that Nietzsche believed that art's very quality of being somehow false might actually serve a crucial and even life-sustaining purpose for humanity. The real interpretive challenge for us then becomes fully understanding in precisely what sense Nietzsche considers art to be false, why he ultimately values this inherent falsity, and how this apparent embrace of illusion ultimately aligns with his own later very strong emphasis on the importance of truthfulness in other areas of his philosophical thought. It's a puzzle.
Okay, so what specific kinds of falsity in art might Nietzsche have been referring to? What does false mean here?
We can usefully distinguish between what philosophers often call representational falsity, where a work of art fundamentally misrepresents the things that it depicts in the world, and mimetic falsity, where art is fundamentally illusory or fake,
Hmm.
resembling something in the world without truly being that thing itself, like a painted apple that you can't actually eat.
Representational versus mimetic. Okay.
Nietzsche's own views on the matter seem to lean more towards the idea of representational falsity, the notion that art often selectively misrepresents the undesirable, painful, or inherently unaffirmable aspects of human life in order to make it appear more beautiful, more meaningful, or ultimately more acceptable and affirmable to us.
So art as a kind of beautiful but ultimately misleading spin on a fundamentally harsh reality. Airbrushing life.
That's certainly one way to potentially understand his perspective. For example, a work of art might idealize certain human characteristics or actions, express propositions about the world that are not literally true, or simply represent even mundane or unpleasant things in a beautiful or aesthetically pleasing way, even if the world itself lacks such inherent beauty. Right. Fictional narratives in general, by their very nature of representing people and events that do not actually exist in the real world, would also fall under this broad category of representational falsity.
And why would Nietzsche ultimately see significant value in these kinds of artistic falsehoods? Why is misrepresentation good?
The prevailing idea among interpreters is that the value of these artistic falsehoods, in Nietzsche's view, lies in their potential to have a fundamentally life-promoting effect on us. Even if they are not literally true, these artistic misrepresentations of reality might foster crucial beliefs, perspectives, or emotional states that help us to better cope with the inherent difficulties of life, endure unavoidable suffering, or even find some sense of meaning or purpose in a world that Nietzsche often saw as fundamentally chaotic and without inherent meaning.
So they help us live, basically.
Right. For instance, the powerful myth of ultimate redemption that we often find in tragic narratives, even if it's not literally true in a metaphysical sense, might still offer a vital sense of psychological solace and enable us to better affirm the difficult realities of human existence.
But this particular view of Nietzsche's appreciation for artistic falsehoods seems to come with some pretty significant philosophical problems and interpretive challenges, doesn't it? It feels a bit too simple, maybe.
It certainly does. From a philosophical perspective, it can be strongly argued that this view potentially conflates the act of representing something as beautiful with the very different act of representing something beautifully.
Ah, good distinction.
Just because a powerful story about the horrors of war is told in a beautiful and compelling way doesn't necessarily mean that it's fundamentally misrepresenting the true ugliness of war itself. There's also the rather questionable underlying assumption that we, as the audience for art, are actually consistently deceived by these artistic falsehoods, which is often not the case at all.
Yeah, we know it's a story.
We generally understand that a novel or a painting is not a literal representation of reality. And from a purely interpretive standpoint, Nietzsche himself often seems to express a strong opposition to this kind of mere aesthetic beautification of harsh realities. He frequently praises artistic creations that directly confront the ugly, the disturbing, and the fundamentally questionable aspects of human existence.
True, he wasn't afraid of the ugly.
Plus, as we discussed earlier, his later very strong emphasis on the paramount importance of truthfulness in other areas of his philosophy, and his call to courageously affirm life exactly as it truly is, seems to directly clash with the idea that we fundamentally need art to conceal difficult realities from ourselves.
So how do we even begin to reconcile this apparent and rather significant contradiction within Nietzsche's aesthetic thought? Art as lies versus the demand for truthfulness.
There are a few different potential avenues for interpretation here. Some scholars suggest that Nietzsche himself never fully and satisfactorily resolves this inherent tension between his apparent appreciation for artistic illusion and his later commitment to truthfulness. Maybe he just lived with the contradiction.
Okay.
Others argue that Nietzsche's own view of the fundamental nature and purpose of art actually evolved over time, perhaps moving away from the idea that art is necessarily based on falsehood. Still, another approach suggests that he viewed art and truthfulness as fundamentally different but equally vital human values that constantly need to be carefully balanced against each other.
Interesting. Maybe it's a balancing act.
But perhaps one of the most compelling alternative interpretations focuses on the concept of mimetic falsity, that other kind of falsity we mentioned. The idea that art celebrates the very nature of illusion itself, fundamentally inviting us to reconsider our often negative attitude towards mere appearance or shine.
So celebrating shine, semblance itself.
On this particular view, art's inherent falsity lies not so much in its misrepresentation of content, but in its fundamental nature as imitation, as a deliberate creation of appearance rather than reality itself.
That's a really interesting and potentially illuminating shift in perspective. It's not primarily about the content of the artistic illusion being factually false, but rather the very fact that it is an acknowledged illusion in the first place that holds value for Nietzsche. The being an illusion is the point.
Exactly. This interpretive approach allows Nietzsche to consistently value the importance of truthfulness in our understanding of the world, while also profoundly valuing the unique power and beauty of art, because art, on this view, doesn't necessarily aim to deceive us with false beliefs about reality. Instead, it boldly highlights and even glorifies the inherent power and profound beauty of illusion itself, inviting us to engage with the world in a more creative and imaginative way. It's appreciating the artifice.
Let's move on now to another really crucial area where Nietzsche's aesthetic views underwent a significant transformation. The complex idea of disinterested aesthetic appreciation. He didn't stick with Schopenhauer on this one.
No, definitely not. This is a truly key shift in Nietzsche's aesthetic thinking. Early on, particularly in The Birth of Tragedy, he seems to have at least partially accepted some version of the traditional philosophical idea that genuine aesthetic pleasure is fundamentally disinterested, meaning it's separate from our personal desires, interests, and practical concerns. But by at least 1886, with the publication of works like On the Genealogy of Morality, he had come to consistently and quite vehemently reject this entire viewpoint.
Vehemently rejected. Okay.
His sharp criticism, especially in Genealogy 3.6, is closely linked to a fascinating critique of influential aestheticians like Immanuel Kant and Arthur Schopenhauer who, Nietzsche argues, fundamentally approached the entire aesthetic problem from the rather limited perspective of the detached spectator.
What exactly was Nietzsche's core problem with this predominant philosophical focus on the passive spectator and the seemingly objective ideal of disinterestedness? Why did he hate that view so much?
Well, the philosophical notion of aesthetic disinterest has meant slightly different things to different thinkers throughout history. But Nietzsche's criticism seems to be multifaceted and to target several key aspects of this traditional view. Some interpretations suggest that his primary objection to Kant wasn't so much about the very concept of disinterestedness itself, but rather about Kant's strong emphasis on the supposed universality of judgments of taste. The idea that if something is truly beautiful, it should be judged as such by all rational beings.
Ah, the universality claim.
Nietzsche, on this particular view, might have believed that higher beauty, the most profound and transformative aesthetic experiences, might only be truly accessible through the intense, perhaps even ecstatic experiences of a select few individuals, perhaps primarily the artists themselves, rather than through detached and universally applicable rational reflection.
So it's potentially about a kind of hierarchy or stratification of aesthetic experience. Not everyone gets the real beauty.
That's certainly a possible interpretation. But a more radical and perhaps more widely accepted reading argues that Nietzsche fundamentally rejects the very idea of the aesthetic state as a kind of passive reception of some pre-existing quality called beauty. This alternative view places a much stronger emphasis on the active process of creative artistic activity as the primary and most significant source of all aesthetic value.
So value comes from the creator, not the spectator.
Exactly. The fundamental problem with the traditional spectator-focused aesthetics, then, is that it mistakenly locates aesthetic value in the wrong place in the finished artwork itself, or in the subjective experiences it causes in a viewer, rather than in the intensely creative and formative act of the artist.
That makes a lot of sense when you think about it. The artist isn't typically a disinterested observer. They are actively and passionately shaping and forming something new. They're invested.
Exactly. It's even been suggested that the traditional spectator-centered standpoint can't even adequately account for the artist's fundamental motivation to create in the first place, especially if we consider the Schopenhauerian idea of the artist achieving a temporary will-less state of pure contemplation. Why would an artist, having reached this state of detached bliss, than be motivated to translate that experience into a tangible work of art intended for others.
Good point. Why bother?
It seems to undermine the very idea of the will being silenced.
Nietzsche himself offers a significantly different perspective on the nature of beauty, doesn't he? He famously quotes the French writer Stendhal, saying that the beautiful is a promise of happiness. That sounds much more interesting.
Yes, and he notably calls Stendhal a genuine spectator, in sharp contrast to figures like Kant and Schopenhauer. This suggests that for Nietzsche, the experience of beauty is fundamentally linked to something that actively evokes a positive, perhaps even anticipatory feeling within us. Later in his philosophical works, he often connects the profound experience of beauty with intense feelings of heightened power and even erotic arousal.
Power and erotic arousal.
Okay, one compelling interpretation suggests that for Nietzsche, finding something to be beautiful isn't primarily about making a detached intellectual judgment, but rather about being powerfully impelled towards further engagement with it, ultimately towards new artistic creation.
So beauty as a kind of catalyst for action, a powerful spur to our own creativity and life affirmation. It makes you want to do something.
Precisely. This aligns with his own apparent approval of Plato's intriguing definition of love in the Symposium as reproduction and birth in beauty. We are inspired by beauty not just to passively admire, but to actively create, to bring something new and valuable into the world.
Interesting link to Plato there, despite the rivalry.
Yeah. However, it's also important to acknowledge that Nietzsche also sometimes employs a more traditional understanding of beauty as a kind of harmonious order and unifying form, particularly in his discussions of the challenging process of self-creation and in his often harsh criticism of what he saw as the chaotic excesses in the later works of Richard Wagner. He wanted form sometimes too.
So there are these seemingly different strands in his thinking about beauty. The Stendhalian promise of happiness, the strong connection to feelings of power and eroticism, and the more classical ideal of harmony and order. How do they fit together?
Yes, and it's certainly possible that these seemingly disparate strands are actually interconnected in Nietzsche's complex thought, perhaps through the underlying idea of formed chaos. The experience of encountering something that exhibits a degree of discernible order and unity, while still hinting at a deeper, more primal underlying dynamism, might be exactly what truly excites and incites our own fundamental creative impulses. It's that tension.
Formed chaos. I like that. This line of thinking naturally leads us to consider another really intriguing and somewhat underexplored aspect of Nietzsche's aesthetics. Its close and often surprising connection to the realm of physiology, biology, and art.
Yes, Nietzsche famously planned a major work entitled Physiology of Aesthetics, even going so far as to declare that aesthetics is indeed nothing but an applied physiology.
Wow, nothing but that's extreme.
It is. While this ambitious project unfortunately never fully materialized in the form of a completed book, the fundamental idea that our biological makeup and our underlying physical states profoundly and directly influence our aesthetic experiences is a significant and recurring theme throughout his later philosophical writings.
He certainly uses a lot of terminology that seems to come from the world of medicine when he's talking about art. Terms like decadent and healthy, for example. It sounds very diagnostic.
Exactly. Some scholars interpret Nietzsche's approach here as being deeply rooted in a post-Darwinian intellectual tradition, suggesting that he was actively aiming for fundamentally evolutionary explanations of our seemingly universal aesthetic preferences. The core idea here is that the long process of biological evolution might have selectively favored our innate tendency to find pleasure and beauty in specific traits and characteristics that were historically associated with reproductive fitness and overall well-being.
So we like things that signal health and fertility, basically.
That's the general evolutionary line. This perspective could potentially explain Nietzsche's frequent and often controversial association of aesthetics with human sexuality and his apparent privileging of human beauty above other forms.
But that kind of explanation doesn't seem to easily account for our genuine appreciation for things like a breathtaking natural landscape or a purely instrumental piece of music that doesn't directly depict human forms. How does evolution explain liking a sunset?
That's a very valid and important point to raise. To address this kind of potential gap in the evolutionary explanation, some scholars suggest that Nietzsche might have appealed to the psychological mechanisms of association. Perhaps we find a certain beauty in non-human phenomena because they somehow remind us, consciously or unconsciously, of admired human qualities.
Maybe.
Or, alternatively, he might have drawn upon something akin to the Freudian idea of the sublimation of the basic sex drive, where fundamental biological urges are redirected into more culturally acceptable aesthetic pursuits. Another intriguing interpretation, which connects back to our previous discussion of beauty and creativity, suggests that the pleasure we take in something like a beautiful sunset might be considered erotic
Yeah.
in a broader sense. Not necessarily sexual, but in the sense that it puts us in a state of heightened creative energy and a powerful affirmation of life.
Erotic in a life-affirming sense.
Right.
Okay. And what about his very specific and sometimes rather judgmental use of those medical terms like decadent and healthy when he's assessing different forms of art? Was he literally trying to diagnose art as being sick or well?
It seems that Nietzsche was likely making claims that were both fundamentally functional and also deeply expressive. When he calls the later art of Richard Wagner decadent, he could be implying that it's both a symptom of Wagner's own personal decline or degeneration, and also that it has a demonstrably negative, perhaps even contagious effect on its audience, weakening their vital life forces.
So bad art makes you weaker.
That seems to be the implication sometimes. However, as you pointed out earlier, Nietzsche also suggests in The Gay Science that there are fundamentally different kinds of human suffering, and that there are corresponding different kinds of art that best cater to these distinct needs of powerfully Dionysian and excessive art for those who are suffering from a kind of overabundance of life and vital energy, and a quieter, more melancholic art for those who are suffering from a fundamental impoverishment or lack of life force.
Different art for different states of being.
His own strong artistic and philosophical approval clearly lies with the former, the art that affirms life in its fullness and even its terror.
This idea of different kinds of art for different kinds of suffering almost sounds like it might be leading towards a more subjective or perspectival view of aesthetic judgment in Nietzsche's later thought, like beauty is in the eye of the beholder's physiology.
Indeed, that's a very astute observation. In some of his later philosophical writings, Nietzsche definitely hints at a form of aesthetic non-cognitivism, suggesting that our deeply felt judgments about what is beautiful might not actually be truth-apt claims about some objective quality in the world at all, but rather powerful expressions of our own fundamentally healthy or diseased evaluative perspectives on existence.
So my taste reflects my health.
Kind of. He even uses the striking analogy of someone who has a disease of the eye. You wouldn't try to refute their distorted vision with logical arguments. However, this particular interpretation is somewhat ambiguous, as the very image of the diseased eye also inherently suggests that some evaluative perspectives might indeed be fundamentally wrong or deeply distorted.
Right, diseased still implies a standard of health. It's exactly. Ultimately, Nietzsche's planned physiology of aesthetics seems to be less about uncovering simple evolutionary origins and more about developing a critical and diagnostic perspective on the complex relationship between art and our overall physical and psychological well-being. It's about judging the effect of art.
Finally, let's touch upon Nietzsche's later thoughts on the art form of tragedy. While he never engaged with it as extensively or with the same initial fervor as he did in The Birth of Tragedy, it clearly remained a profoundly important concept for him throughout his intellectual life. He couldn't let it go.
Absolutely. He continued to see himself as a fundamentally tragic philosopher and consistently emphasized the crucial need for a fundamentally tragic outlook on human existence. The key question for us here is how his own views on the specific nature of tragic pleasure and the enduring value of tragedy itself evolved after the groundbreaking publication of his early work.
Right, how did it change? As we discussed in The Birth of Tragedy, these ideas were deeply intertwined with the concepts of aesthetic justification and metaphysical solace, potentially linked to the sublime experience of confronting suffering as an integral part of a much larger and ultimately aesthetic whole.
But he seemed to offer some rather different and sometimes even quite cynical sounding explanations for our fascination with the tragedy in his later writings, didn't he? Less grand, maybe.
He certainly did. In The Gay Science, he offers a surprisingly reductive account of the profound pleasure we derive from tragedy, suggesting that it's simply the enjoyment of good speeches.
Just good speeches. That's it.
Seems a bit flat, right? In later works like Beyond Good and Evil and Tarkenley, on the genealogy of morality, he even more provocatively suggests that the seemingly paradoxical, painful pleasure of tragedy might actually stem from a kind of underlying human cruelty, either through feelings of schadenfreude, taking pleasure in the misfortune of others, or some form of complex, sadomasochistic self-infliction.
Whoa, cruelty. That's a dark turn.
These later accounts, however, have been widely criticized by scholars for being overly simplistic and for failing to fully capture the complex and deeply cathartic nature of the tragic experience. They don't feel quite right.
But then, somewhat surprisingly, in his final incredibly productive year, It seems like Nietzsche might have actually revisited some of the core ideas about tragedy that he had first explored in The Birth of Tragedy,
Yeah.
A Return to the Beginning.
That's right. In his late work, Twilight of the Idols, there's a rather surprising and intriguing passage that seems to directly echo some of the central themes and even the very language of The Birth of Tragedy,
Really? Like what?
talking about a kind of fundamental Dionysian affirmation of life, the powerful will to life rejoicing even in the necessary sacrifice of its highest types, and the concept of an eternal pleasure of becoming that paradoxically includes a profound pleasure in annihilation.
Pleasure in annihilation. That sounds very Birth of
No.
Tragedy.
It does. This has led some interpreters to argue that Nietzsche might have, at least in some way, returned to some of his earlier metaphysical leanings about the ultimate nature of reality and our relationship to it.
But that would be quite surprising given his much stronger and more consistent criticisms of traditional metaphysics in his later philosophical works. Didn't he reject all that?
Exactly. It's quite possible that in this later passage, Nietzsche was not necessarily reasserting those early metaphysical views in a dogmatic way, but rather recalling them in order to highlight the underlying consistency of his lifelong rejection of all forms of philosophical pessimism and his enduring commitment to a powerful form of life affirmation, even in the face of profound suffering. Maybe it was more symbolic.
Okay, maybe just echoing the spirit of it.
Elsewhere in Twilight of the Idols, however, he presents a somewhat different conception of tragedy, emphasizing the tragic artist's remarkable psychological condition of being without fear in the face of the terrible and the questionable aspects of existence, and the subsequent triumphant celebration of the powerful, even warlike human soul in its courageous confrontation with all that is fearful and uncertain.
Tragedy as a celebration of strength in the face of fear. That sounds more like later Nietzsche.
This later conception certainly sounds much more in line with Nietzsche's mature philosophical focus on the will to power as a fundamental driving force in human life.
Makes sense.
Precisely. One particularly compelling interpretation of this later view connects it directly to Nietzsche's concept of the will to power as fundamentally an ongoing process of overcoming resistances and challenges, suggesting that tragedy ultimately invites us to radically reframe our understanding of suffering, not as something to be simply avoided, but rather as a necessary catalyst for growth and a crucial challenge to be overcome.
Suffering as a resistance to overcome for the will to power.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
However, this particular view also has its limitations, as not all forms of suffering necessarily lead to positive achievement or personal growth. Sometimes suffering is just suffering.
Sure.
Ultimately, while Nietzsche never quite arrived at a fully consistent and comprehensive theory of tragedy that spanned his entire career, his lifelong and deeply passionate engagement with this complex art form undoubtedly yielded profound and enduring insights into its crucial historical context, its defiant resistance to simplistic moralistic interpretations, and its unique capacity to grapple with our deepest and most fundamental existential questions about the very nature and value of human life.
So, to sum up our deep dive into the complex and ever-evolving landscape of Nietzsche's philosophical aesthetics, we've explored his significant early engagement with the ideas of Schopenhauer, Wagner, and Schiller, the development of his enduring Apollonian and Dionysian framework in The Birth of Tragedy, his later more critical views on art as illusion, his radical critique of disinterestedness, and his provocative reevaluation of beauty, and his lifelong, unwavering fascination with the profound power and enigmatic meaning of tragedy, all viewed through the critical lens of a philosopher actively wrestling with the most fundamental questions about the nature and ultimate value of both art and human existence itself. He was really philosophizing about art.
And by fundamentally acting as a philosopher, constantly questioning assumptions and pushing the very boundaries of aesthetic thought, Nietzsche challenged conventional understandings of art's essential role and its ultimate value in ways that continue to profoundly resonate with artists, philosophers, and, well, anyone who has ever been deeply moved by a work of art, right up to the present day.
Here's a final thought for you to really chew on. Nietzsche famously asserted that we have art so that we do not perish from the truth. After everything we've discussed today, does this provocative statement truly resonate with your own personal experiences of engaging with art in its many forms?
Yeah, think about that.
Does art ultimately offer us a necessary and perhaps even life-saving form of illusion, a vital way to cope with the often harsh realities of existence? Or does it, perhaps more profoundly, offer us a deeper, albeit a very different, way of actually engaging with the fundamental nature of reality itself, a way that transcends mere factual representation? What does art do for us, really?
We strongly encourage you to delve even deeper into Nietzsche's own fascinating works, as well as the writings of the other influential philosophers and key concepts that we've discussed with you today. This deep dive is really just intended to be a valuable starting point for your own ongoing personal exploration and thoughtful reflection on these enduring and ever-relevant ideas. There's so much more there.
Thanks so much for joining us for this philosophical deep dive.